Hello, welcome back. In this module, we're going to talk about company policy. As we've mentioned in some of the other modules, company policies are important pieces of documentation which guide you into what you can and cannot do. So what kind of policies does your company have, or should it have, and what should you be aware of? Well, typical policies. Number one, acceptable use. Acceptable use of the internet, acceptable use of IT resources. Acceptable use can cover everything that you use as an asset within the company. The second is security policies. Now, security policies tend to be quite technical and aren't necessarily exposed to the employee, but you should be at least aware of what technology should be used in each context to give compliance to your security policy. I'll give you an example. So if we looked at virtual private networks or VPNs, which is a way of securing information when going across public networks, well, your company may say that if you want to access company resources over a public Wi-Fi network, then it needs to go via a VPN. In which case, your next question would probably be, well, how do I set one of those up then? That's a great question to go and ask your IT help desk. Okay, and then you'll have some technology guidelines. Now, before the days of bring your own device, they generally tended to be, you get a choice of, I don't know, one desktop computer or two laptop computers, you'll get this kind of phone, you may even have this kind of car in your car policy. But nowadays, with bring your own device, those technology guidelines may actually say, these are acceptable technologies or acceptable platforms for you to use company resources, whether or not they're being provided by the company or by yourself. So, for example, in the world of mobile phones, it may be that only certain operating systems, certain Android operating systems, certain Windows, certain Apple operating systems, are permitted to access company resources. And that might be for good reasons, such as the way data is encrypted on the device. Okay, so that's technology guidelines. There will be many other policies your company has, but that you needn't necessarily be aware of. So, for example, disaster recovery, business continuity, right? Don't worry about those. You may come across them, but generally you won't actually be involved in setting the policy, though in disaster recovery, for example, you might be involved if a crisis occurs. So let's focus down on the one that's probably going to affect you the most, which is acceptable use. So acceptable use generally covers if and when you can use the internet. Some companies say for private use, you can only use the internet in your private time in the office. So that might be lunch times or after working hours. Right? Some companies don't allow any use, others allow you any time. All right? You also should see in there what content is off limits. Many companies have security controls in place that will stop content such as violence, pornography, radical views coming through on your internet connections. Others may not have the security controls in place, but will have a policy that says what you can and cannot access. And as we'll see when we go through the business context and what your employer can do in terms of monitoring your use, you want to make sure you're complying to those policies. Right? And one that you really should be aware of is the safe and responsible use of email. In other words, should you be using corporate email for private use, even when you're using it for corporate use? What is the kind of information you can share? Are there templates you should be using? Right? So think about what you can use email for. Email is still, well, probably the major infection vector in most organizations. Now, acceptable use policies can be tens, hundreds of pages, but generally they'll get the main points across in one page. So go and look for it. All right, so find and read your own policy and here's our other piece of advice, understand what happens if you break the rules. So, for example, in many companies I've worked with, accessing inappropriate content over corporate resources is a gross misconduct. In other words, you can be summarily dismissed. Right? So you need to understand what the impact of you doing something is for going against the policy. All right, well that's it really for this module, and I'd like you to answer the question underneath. But I'd also like you to go back and find out what policies you have in place. Thank you.